Very much, Les. Thank you very much, and thanks, Lawrence, also for the kind invitation for both from the AIIA Victoria. I greatly appreciate the opportunity to come to this part of Australia. Being based at the University of Sydney, the U.S. Studies Centre obviously does a lot of work in that part of Australia, but we are certainly committed to trying to be as active as we can interstate, reaching out across the country and engaging as we should as a institution which has been is intended to have a national mandate to help improve awareness and understanding of the United States here in Australia, to work towards improving and deepening positive relationships across the spectrum of our relationship between the United States and Australia, and we hope to keep building towards the prospect of being the best center for the study of the United States outside of the United States. We're making a big stride in this direction. Just to let you know a couple of interesting new developments. We've recently opened a sister campus at the University of Western Australia in Perth called the Perth US Asia Center. We're hoping it's going to be modeled closely after the way we have been doing things in Sydney. But it's a big step forward, and it's going to open up some new doors, I think, in the sense that we want to do more in Asia, that is to say, understand America's role in Asia. And we think strongly that our partnership in Perth is going to help us do that. And secondly, in the coming months, we'll be opening an office in New York. This is a big step forward for us. Obviously, we've never had a presence overseas, but it's going to help us not only expand our programming and activity and so forth in the United States, but very importantly, having a foothold there, and hopefully more than that, is only going to help us have a better understanding and appreciation of what's happening in the United States. So as part of all of that, it's just a great pleasure to be able to come and be able to speak in front of this august group here in Victoria, and thank you very, very much for the invitation. Tonight, as Les has already mentioned, I wanted to talk about the United States in the Pacific century. Maybe I'm already telegraphing how I feel about America's presence in this part of the world. But what I want to try and do is at least set up the debate a little bit about the United States and China, to talk about a bit of history about America's background in this part of the world, and then go over, maybe not too onerously, some facts and figures which I find interesting about America's continued presence here and its likelihood to be so going forward. We need to talk about the pivot, or the so-called rebalancing to Asia, criticize it, I think, in some ways, but actually look at it more carefully and understand what its intentions surely are, and then think about the long term. Having talked about the history and where we are at the moment, I think that tells a lot about where the United States is likely to be, even 10, 20 years forward, as difficult as it sometimes can be to predict what's going to happen in the future, and then maybe answer the question about the rise of China. So it's a bit of past, present, and future. So let's see. The conventional narrative. I think we've heard a lot about how America's power has declined. That globalization has surely diffused around the world the power that different nations can bring to bear into the international system, and it's probably correct that we're moving into an era of greater multipolarity, greater narrowing, surely, of relative power across a range of important countries. And some people would argue that in trying over the past 60 years to be the predominant power globally, not least here in the Asia Pacific, that the United States has in many ways exhausted itself. And we've seen this maybe most recently in the wake of the global financial crisis. And that as a result of these and many, many other factors, America is simply not in a position to meet any potential challenges, whether benign or malign, from China going forward, and that we're really moving into a very, very different era, even in the next 10, 20, 30 years in terms of global power and especially regional power balances. The question I have is whether that's really true. The analyst, I think, has to try and not only look at what's right in front of her face or his face. The analyst has to try and think a little bit more deeply about trends, both historically going backwards and to the best extent we can look at some immutable factors, relatively predictable factors, to help us understand where the future is likely to go. Certainly looking historically, we know that the United States has been, for a relatively long time, certainly as long as Australia, a Pacific nation, meaning looking towards the Pacific as part of its own character. I like to always note that it was in 1784, a ship set sail from New York called the Empress of China, which ended up becoming the first trading ship to land on Chinese shores. But it was not long after that, of course, that the United States continued a rather expansive and rapid set of initiatives moving to the west to seek that other shore. And of course, we're all familiar with those: Louisiana Purchase, the war with Mexico, to encompass now what is most of southwestern United States, including California, the Alaska Purchase in 1867, moving quite rapidly at the end of the 19th century with the war with Spain, which allowed then America to take over what is now the Philippines, Guam, etc., and a range of other islands in this part of the world. Now well over 115 years ago has been that presence here in this region. American political, cultural, diplomatic, educational engagement of China began well over 100 years ago, rapidly advancing with the advent of the Pacific War and with ultimately the defeat of Japan in this part of the world, a true major military, political, diplomatic, and economic presence, probably represented most strongly through its relationships with its 5 major treaty allied partners in this part of the world. Some attempts at establishing some multilateral partnerships in the region like CENTO and CETO, but now relying primarily on the so-called hub and spokes system here. And very importantly, I think a lot of observers dismiss or underplay the fact that it was the opening that the United States made, of course mostly attributed to Nixon and Kissinger, to China at a very difficult period of China's history in the early 1970s that laid the pathway forward for what has really been one of the most remarkable, quite historical moments, certainly in the 20th century, of China's return to the international system, facilitated by, fostered by, encouraged by the United States, which sought to engage this newly emerging power across the full spectrum of the relationship, which has only deepened America's commitment to an Asia-Pacific future, which is not about containing China really, but about trying to deepen relationships with that great country. I mean, that brings us to today, in some ways, to where we are today. And looking at some of the data, again, is quite remarkable. This is not an America that's backing away from this region, and that well predates the so-called pivot. I found it interesting that since 2001, and don't forget that in that period since 2001 we've had the GFC, American investment in this region has not at all slowed. It has increased quite remarkably by 166%. And of course, we've encouraged greater Asian investment in the United States as well. US FDI in the region is huge. It's not as large as it is in Europe, which is enormous, or in Latin America, but it is the third largest, at least, in terms of American FDI in the world. And the largest recipient of American FDI, just to note, is in Australia. There's been an increase in Asian students being welcomed to the United States and vice versa. We're seeing more and more US students moving over to Asia to engage with this dynamic part of the world. Tourism from Asia earned the US economy more revenue than tourism from Latin America or from the European Union in 2011. I should just note and underscore that Chinese foreign direct investment in Australia is tiny compared to what American foreign direct investment is in Australia. People tend to think that China is somehow the biggest trade and investment partner of Australia, which is only partially true. Probably in terms of overall trade, that may be the case. But in terms of investment, which we could debate is a more important indicator of the depth and breadth of economic relationship, the United States is by far the largest investor in Australia. It gets deeper than that. The United States over the past decade has tried to increase its intensity of free trade arrangements in different parts of this region. You think about Singapore in 2004, the Australian FTA in 2005, the recently concluded free trade arrangement with South Korea in 2012, and of course going forward, there are some high expectations that the Trans-Pacific Partnership free trade arrangement could be concluded by the end of this year, and that engages some 11 current participants: Australia, Brunei, Canada, Chile, Malaysia, Mexico, New Zealand, Peru, Singapore, Vietnam. The Japanese have now joined in, and there are even some messages, some signals that perhaps China may also be interested in being a part of this. Another indicator of America's attempt to re-engage and be a part of this region for the future and for the long term. Beyond trade, I think it's interesting on the diplomatic front, certainly with towards the end of the George W. Bush administration and accelerating with the Obama administration, a very serious effort to really pick up the diplomatic game of the United States here in this part of the world, gaining membership in the East Asia Summit, setting up an annual US-ASEAN Summit beginning in 2009, the Obama administration signing the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, a treaty of amity and cooperation, and I think importantly, sending a specifically designated ambassador to ASEAN based in Jakarta. These are important diplomatic steps. Foreign assistance. It's the largest of any region in the world. The foreign assistance coming into the Asia Pacific from the United States is about $16.8 billion. That's more than any other region in the world. And then, of course, last but I guess not least, the one issue that seems to get discussed the most, as important as it is, but still just one part of the big puzzle, is of course the continued American commitment militarily to this part of the region, a willingness to demonstrate through the resources that are invested here, a commitment to the various formal treaty obligations which America has, but also to the broader security of the region. And the numbers there, I think, say a lot about America's continuing commitment. Maybe one of the most important figures, though, I think, is the announcement that Leon Panetta made about a year ago that we were going to literally rebalance or literally shift the force posture away from the Atlantic and towards the Pacific, from a 50-50 split to something more on the way of a 60-40 split in terms of assets and overall force posture commitments here in the Asia-Pacific region. So I think, looking across that historical sweep and then just thinking what's happened in just the last 10 years, before, most of this well before the so-called pivot was even announced here on these shores. If you really look at it that way, it's rather clear that the United States is committed, understands the importance of this region, and is unlikely to be leaving anytime soon. Now, getting into the Obama administration, well before he spoke before the joint session of the Australian Parliament, even when he was a candidate for president, he signaled pretty early on that he had these intentions to try and demonstrate America's commitment to this region. Interesting small factoid. Hillary Clinton, her first trip as Secretary of State when she took office in 2009 was to Asia. But who cares? Why is that important? Well, it was the first time a U.S. Secretary of State traveled to Asia first in 50 years. That hadn't happened in 50 years. It's an important, you could say it's merely symbolic, but I think those sorts of choices are taken quite seriously in the State Department and in the White House, and I think it was trying to signal something that is significant. Now, of course, in November 2009, on his first trip to the United States, President Obama said in Japan, "There must be no doubt, as America's first Pacific president, I promise you that this Pacific nation will strengthen and sustain our leadership in this vitally important part of the world." That was 2 years before Secretary of State Clinton's now well-known foreign policy article came out, and 2 years before the president gave his now very well-known speech before the joint session of the Australian Parliament. So all just by way of saying that this has been a part of American thinking actually for some time. All that said, I think we can be critical. We should at least be constructively critical and analyze a little bit the pivot, now called the rebalancing. It was probably an attempt to break with the past, obviously. There were political reasons for this. The president knew very well, as did his advisors, that Americans were tired and ready to move on from the military commitments that had been made in Southwest Asia, in Iraq, and Afghanistan. And so speaking about a more dynamic region where it was unlikely we would be engaged in war was clearly going to be a politically wise move. But I think beyond that, and more deeply, more importantly and strategically, Americans in Washington were hearing from our friends and allies in this part of the world who are asking seriously about whether or not America would remain committed here and return to or rebuild, re-emphasize its strategic emphasis in this part of the world. And of course, a part of that, let's say, an important part, but just a part of that, was because of concerns in the region about China's rise. Now, I think it was poorly worded. The very word pivot, of course, has all sorts of different connotations, which we've all heard about. And I think also the way that the military component of the rebalancing or pivot seemed to rise to the top of most people's understanding. That too probably sent some unfortunate signals to the region, not least to China, about the intention of this new emphasis in this region. And what we've seen then, over the course of the past 6 months or so, is what I've been calling a rebalancing of the rebalance. In other words, a rebalancing of the pivot, an attempt to try and re-explain what this is really about, to downplay military aspects to draw more attention to other important developments and intentions and policies of the United States government across the diplomatic and economic fields, and of course to reassure over time that this isn't merely the idea of one or two persons in the U.S. Administration, but indeed a strategy which the President is fully behind. And if you really want to read out what I think is probably the best sort of summation of this rebalancing, would be to look to Tom Donilon, recently retired National Security Advisor Tom Donilon's speech before the Asia Society about the pivot in March of this year. Not to get in that too deeply, but he does speak about what's most important for America in this part of the world, includes such things as strengthening alliances, so yes, there's a military aspect to it, but more importantly and more broadly, engaging emerging powers such as India, Indonesia, building a constructive relationship with China, which is critical, strengthening regional institutions, the governance structures in this part of the world, which will help sustain a more peaceful, prosperous, stable region, and strengthening regional economic architecture as well. So that really brings us quite to the present. The real question, I suppose, for a lot of us is policy, even strategy, even well thought out and in some ways obvious reasons to be engaged in this region are only as good as the long-term commitment, the long-term will, and indeed the long-term capacity for a country like the United States to sustain it over time. I want to take a look at that. Does China, or does the United States have the ability? Does the United States have the ability to sustain this re-emphasis and long-term interest that it surely has to remain engaged in this part of the world, not least in the context of a rising China? I think American staying power for the years and decades ahead is worthy of some questioning. I mean, we all know that there are a lot of challenges in the United States, a lot of problems that have to be worked through. Just to name a couple, the increasing disconnect between the well-to-do and the less well-so. Continuing weaknesses in the primary and secondary education systems in the United States that leave, I think, too many young people ill-prepared to meet the challenges of a much more globalized world. Persistent unemployment since 2008, a lack of adequate investment in 21st century communications, transportation, and energy infrastructure, and enormous fiscal challenges and budgetary cutbacks at the national, state, and local levels, not to mention huge debt levels even at the household level. And we haven't even begun to talk about the political dysfunction in Washington today, which seems almost incapable of developing bipartisan strategies to work through some of these issues. So I think we're all well aware of what these challenges are. At the same time, I guess, again, looking to longer term trends, I think there's a quite promising story that can still be told, while still acknowledging that there's enormous challenges at a tactical level to be worked through, not least in Washington. And here I'm thinking of things like relatively low energy costs, the possibilities inherent in the unconventional or shale gas boom in the United States. Relatively low cost, but relatively high skill manufacturing sector in the United States compared to other developing countries. And of course, there is growing pent-up demand in the United States, not least amongst baby boomers like myself, who are looking for new opportunities, waiting for that recovery to be opened up. It's not just pent-up demand, pent-up capital The CEO of Goldman Sachs, writing last year in November, he says there's more than $1 trillion of cash that is sitting on the balance sheets of U.S. non-financial companies, awaiting greater economic and fiscal certainty in the United States that can then be invested in goods, in people, and in innovation. But I think even more deeply, looking over the long term, is the demographic facts. These are more immutable. These are a little bit easier to see trending in certain directions with more certainty. I mean, barring major catastrophe, which we can't predict, none of us can quite well predict, the United States is in a far better position demographically than almost any other major economy in the world. Comparatively high birth rate, driven in large measure by an openness to a relative openness to immigration, assures that compared to other major economies, the United States is going to have a larger younger population going forward, able to provide a good ratio to those that are retiring. I mean, some of the figures when you look at this are quite remarkable. Economies like Japan, the European Union, Korea, Russia, even China, the relative ratios of working people to those that are retiring is going to shrink. Most importantly, Japan is going to shrink by 40%, its working population, going up to 2050. The European Union by 25%. Even China's working population is going to decrease by about 10%. So demographically, I think there's good news about the long-term future for the United States. There are other aspects that we could talk about. They get a little bit less tangible, I suppose, in terms of soft power, in terms of a relatively stable rule of law system, a relatively stable international environment around the United States. All of this, I think, adds up in ways that, well, maybe not in the next 3 or 4 years, maybe not even in the next 5 years. But I think looking out longer, it paints a more positive picture than I think often gets stated. And that's certainly true in comparison to China. Talking to some students at the University of Sydney a couple of weeks ago, I asked them, if you could have 100,000 US dollars today to keep for the next 40 years, or its equivalent in Chinese renminbi, which would you rather have? And that's a question that bankers, investors, households all over the world, whether they know it or not, are asking. We can have a debate about that, but I think the answer there is pretty clear. And that speaks to a confidence that I think many would have about the future. And it's not ill-founded. I mean, I think we could talk about China. This is a country that I've devoted a lot of time to trying to understand, and enormous problems. I mean, I think we have to try and right or at least rebalance, if that's the right word, the conventional wisdom about China's future as well. That's not to say that we don't want a future with China. We do want a future with China in which it emerges as a more stable, more productive, more prosperous, more just, more sustainable society. That is in all of our interests. But to question whether that's possible doesn't necessarily say you wouldn't like to see those outcomes. And I think we have to ask ourselves seriously, are those the kinds of outcomes that we can hope for in China going forward? Some of those questions actually, from a basic policy perspective, might not be that difficult. I mean, I think China can reform its state-owned enterprise system. It can make the right choices to move from an export-led to a more consumption-led economy. It actually could make the right choices to open up opportunity for a more just society in terms of rule of law, mitigating corruption, letting its judiciary and its media communities be a loyal opposition, and be a watchdog for the country. Those things actually could happen. I doubt it, but they could happen. They're policy choices. More intractable, more troubling for me at least, looking at China's future, are things that are almost too late to change. Things like environmental degradation, depleting water supplies, and I think most importantly, as we've already talked about, the demographic future of China. These are huge challenges that this country faces, and while we would all wish China the best, we want them to work through them, at the same time, we know that these are going to be big, big problems for its long-term future. Perhaps even more immutable for China's long-term future is simply where it sits, where it is geographically. China borders on 14 countries by land and shares often disputed territorial borders with several others, and it is an economy which is enormously dependent upon its maritime approaches for its future economic growth. In a word or two, it doesn't enjoy, quite frankly, a very favorable geostrategic position. So I question whether over the long term, all the talk of China's rise and overtaking of others in the world is going to be the kind of outcome that many assume. When I put all this together, I recognize that these are all debatable points. Uh-oh, what's happened? I recognize too that there's no doubt that China's rising, that its military is certainly improving, and is obviously going to present new and interesting challenges for its neighbors. But at the same time, I think we need to be a little bit more hard-headed about where the future is going, both for the United States, for China, and what that is going to mean for Australia and many, many other countries of the Asia Pacific. So, looking ahead, I'm quite reminded of a very old and probably tired saying by Yogi Berra, who said, predictions are hard, especially when they're about the future. He was an old baseball player in New York, but I think that's good wisdom. But if we look into the future, try to draw from what we know about history, what we know about the recent past and commitments on the part of the United States, and what we have a pretty good sense of where certain trends are going to be going over the course of the next decade or so, I come out relatively optimistic about the United States continuing to play a major role in this part of the world. And it's not only because of that, as I say in this last comment here, I think the future success of the Asia century or the Pacific century will need a vibrant, significant presence of the United States in this part of the world to fully realize the promise of the Pacific century. So, with that, I'll conclude. Thank you very much once again.